times. Absolutely fascinating, our seasonal calendar and how we are still standing, and I will stand up. I now travel with a stool. It's called age appropriate behavior. But we stand on every time we have a seasonal celebration is related to the seasons. We are standing in a piece of time that has roots that go way, way, way back. There was a book that I can't remember his name, but he's still living in Littleton. Oh dear, he's a wonderful writer. But he wrote a book called Ceremonial Time. And any of you have read it, and if you haven't, meaning you might like to read it, it's the story of 1 square mile in Littleton. 1 square mile, the history of that 1 square mile. And from its very earliest possible beginnings to the present day. And that's what happens with us on holiday. So our Thanksgiving Day indeed has an American aspect to it because of when we celebrate it and the foods that go along with that celebration. But the fact that we have a day to stop and feel gratitude and be grateful and give thanks and get together with friends and family and have a huge feast is something that, as I say, goes back thousands and thousands of years, called a harvest holiday. And that's what our Thanksgiving Day is. I was just remembering with Gina, today is the 11th of November. Today is the 13th of November. The 11th of November, 2 days ago, now known as Veterans Day, formerly known as Armistice Day. Well, this is another piece of calendar history. Okay, formerly known as Armistice Day, remembering the end of World War II, World War I. But before that, all across Europe, November 11th was St. Martin's Day or Martin Mass. And St. Martin was the saint on the Christian calendar, which dominated for 2,000 years all of Western Europe. St. Martin was the saint who took care of the poor. And on that day, the legend was that here comes St. Martin riding across the horizon with his tattered cloak, because he was a poor saint, blowing out the back of him on his white horse and stopping and sharing food and necessary items, including his cloak, if somebody didn't have warm clothes, with all the poor that he met along the way. That was a harvest holiday. There's an entire menu that goes around, old menu that goes around St. Martin's Day, which includes not roast turkey, because turkeys are American, but roast goose. And you would slaughter a goose if you're lucky enough to have one, and have that as your harvest feast on St. Martin's Day. Before that, in the UK, to this very day, their harvest festival starting in September and going on. As a matter of fact, the first one used to start. Are any of you familiar with the Celtic calendar? And it's a fascinating calendar if you ever have. I mean, if you get interested in it, it's fascinating the way the year is divided into eights, not into quarters, but into eights. And anyway, there is, I believe there was a movie or a Broadway play, Dancing at La Nasa. Do any of you remember that at all? It's a Celtic, an Irish movie. Well, that has to do with the first wheat harvest. And that was a day in August that was always set aside, called Lammas or Lammas Tide, to celebrate the first wheat harvest. because wheat was very important to all of Europe and the British Isles. When that little band of what we came to call pilgrims, the separatists from the Church of England, arrived in what was to become Plymouth Plantation in 1620, they already had long experience with having a harvest celebration, getting together, giving thanks, and having a celebration because the harvest had been good. We are currently, I'll sit down now. We are currently facing, I'm sorry.
I just have to interrupt for 1 second. Somebody's possibly parked in the handicap spot. And if you are, we have somebody.
And I have a handicap, but I just was drawing on me, but I didn't put it up.
Oh, okay. Yeah, somebody is also waiting. So I'll let them know that you have a placard.
I have it right here. I just remember things now. So. What do you want me to do? Want me to go bring it out? I'll bring it out. No,
Sorry, Betsy.
Okay.
What you call older
Yeah, all right, where was I? Besides sitting down. I got so interested that I lost track completely. But my point is that this is an all-American harvest, our Thanksgiving Day. And that first year there was no Thanksgiving because there was no harvest. The second year there was a harvest. And there was a day set aside for what was a very traditional day of giving thanks. It was probably all day in the tiny little house of worship. And I think it must have been a rather miserable day to sit all day long in church. And but after that came the feasting and 4 days of eating and cooking and games and all of that. So even our football game has roots in harvest holiday because games were always played. First came the thank you, then came the feasting, and then came the game. So when you throw yourself down in front of football, or half of your household throws itself down in front of football, they might not be moving and they might not even be awake, but they are certainly enacting what enjoying a game on that particular day. The food that we eat on Thanksgiving, if you stop to think about what our traditional Thanksgiving meal, at least here in New England, is, we have the turkey as the centerpiece. We usually have corn of some kind or another. We have potatoes. We have bread that goes into the turkey, creates a stuffing of some kind or another. We have beans. Sometimes we have peas, but we certainly have beans. And we often have apples. Those are all not the apples, but the beans and the potatoes and the turkey and the squash and the corn, all Native American, all foods from North or South America, mainly originating in what we now call the Southwest of our country, or Mexico, Central America, and potatoes come from Peru. Every single time you bite into a potato, whether it's fried, mashed, baked, whatever, you're biting into a piece of ancient history. Potatoes are native to the mountainous regions of Peru. They never left South America continent until the Spaniards arrived and took them back to Spain. And then they spread like wildfire across Europe. corn, as we all know, is native. Did you know corn is a grass? This is a miniature ear of corn, but all of the grains that we eat, most of the grains that we eat, are in the grass family. And this is the largest member of the grass family. We eat a lot of grass, even on Thanksgiving. We eat a lot of grass. Corn is what sustained the indigenous people on the North and South American continent. And corn is what kept those first English alive in what was to become Plymouth Plantation. Corn actually kept a lot of people alive. It has a fascinating history. And there is a book, bless you. There is a book that if you're at all interested in food and where it comes from and why we do things, you know, why do we do this? What is this all about? It's called America's Founding Food. It was written by two librarians from Rhode Island. I hope they are alive and well today. The book came out maybe 10 or so years ago, and I don't know if they've written any more, but this is absolutely fascinating book, and I would highly recommend if any of you are interested in the history of food or why in the world you're doing what you're doing on Thanksgiving Day, and what its implications are, what its backstory is, then this is the book that's going to illuminate all of that for you. It's just so beautifully written and so totally fascinating. If it wasn't for corn, that first English settlement would never have survived, period. End of story. It was corn that kept those first settlers alive here in New England, and it was corn that kept a lot of the population alive. However, corn came to be associated as the years went by with Native Americans and those indigenous people, and that term was definitely not used in those days. And so even though corn was used in almost every household in New England from the very beginning, because it was easy to grow, it kept well, you could dry it and use it all winter long, very important. But corn indicated, eating lots of corn indicated that you probably weren't particularly wealthy, because it came to be associated with poorer people, people who didn't have a lot of money, people who couldn't afford to grow wheat or to have that nice white bread that some wealthier people had. The first American cookbook, first cookbook ever published in the United States of America, was published by Amelia Simmons, a woman who there is very little known about her. She was from Connecticut. She describes herself as not being well educated, but she certainly wrote a brilliant cookbook, and hers cookbook was the first cookbook to ever mention using, that was 1796, 1620. The English got introduced to corn. 1796 was the first time corn was ever mentioned in a cookbook. All the cookbooks that had been written before Amelia Simmons in 1796 came from England. All the cookbooks in New England came from England and were reprints. They were brought over and under contract and were required to be reprinted. And so they sold very briskly in Boston. But they were all English ingredients. So if you can get your hands on a facsimile, a replica, a reprint of an early, if you're interested in food, say a cookbook from England, an English cookbook in the late 1500s, early 1600s, up until the 1700s, and you begin to read the recipes and you go, oh, look at all, boy, they used a lot of cinnamon. They used a lot of this. They used a lot of that. Oh, that's really interesting, kind of thing. Those books were all for well-to-do English people. They had nothing to do with the colonists who were making a new country on this side of the Atlantic. It wasn't until Amelia Simmons published her cookbook that corn was first mentioned. And then she had several recipes calling for corn. If any of you like Indian pudding, or if anybody in this room like Indian pudding, yes. Have you made Indian pudding? Does anybody?
My mother did. She's been dead a long time, but she made Indian food.
Yeah.
It takes a while.
And my husband made likes Indian pudding, and it's on our list to make, because we had a good friend who made delicious Indian pudding. And when I was a kid, we used to go to the Union Oyster House on high occasions. On high occasions, we would go to the Union Oyster House, and you could order Indian pudding for dessert. You could also order coffee jello with whipped cream, which was another really good dessert that you never get anymore. But Indian pudding has nothing to do with being made by Indians. It was not a pudding that the Native Americans made. The Indian part was this. Corn wasn't even referred to as corn. It was called, in before the War of Independence, this was called Indian, just referred to as Indian. Indian meal, just Indian, hence Indian pudding. A pudding made of ground corn, molasses, sugar, if you wanted to add sugar, if you had the sugar, but you certainly would have the molasses. And then any kind of fruits that you would like to add into it. And I read recipes for Indian pudding that call for blackberries, cranberries, blueberries, all kinds. And then all of that was put into what was called a pudding bag, but it was really just a heavy piece of cloth that you put your mix in, and then you pulled it up, tied it at the top so that nothing leaked out, and then dropped it into a pot and boiled it. And when you opened it, it was a firm ball. And so you could scoop it out. And if there was some left over, you could put it in another container and chill it, and then slice it and fry it up if you wanted to. It was very nourishing, very good. And I just read that there used to be a controversy about Indian pudding, because in the beginning, the puddings were served at the beginning of the meal. In the late 1600s into the mid 1700s, the pudding was served at the beginning of the meal. After about 1750 or so, puddings began to be served at the end of the meal. And guess what? It all had to do with politics. When I just cracked up when I read that, it all had to do with politics. If you were a follower of the Federalists, if you believed in the Federalists, you served your pudding whatever kind of pudding it was, whether it's Indian pudding or another kind of pudding, at the beginning of your meal. But if you were a Jeffersonian and you believed in what Thomas Jefferson was saying, how a country should be formed and run, while you had your pudding at the end of the meal. We haven't changed one. And sit down at your Thanksgiving table and your heart's in your mouth because you go, okay, here comes cousin Alice. I hope we don't bring up that subject again this year. Or you have rules posted on your front door. There will be no politics, religion, or weather discussed in this home. Or you put a list of this is what we will be discussing today. It will be football, football, football. And how did you cook the turkey? And where did you get that delicious pie? Kind of thing. The food that we put on our table on Thanksgiving Day is fascinating. And I would encourage you to really look hard at that food and think about it. There's so many different things that you can learn. This book, I was just introduced to, thanks to a webinar last week. I had never heard of it. It came out last year. I borrowed it from our library. And you may very well have it here.
I'll check.
Women in the Kitchen and Willem, Willen. And this is a book about the cookbooks written and published by women that have changed the way that America views its food, cooks its food, serves its food, and eats its food. Beginning back in the 1600s and moving straight up into Alice Waters today out in California, through Julia, through Fanny Farmer, through Mrs. Rombauer and Joy of Cooking, and ending with Alice Waters. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating and very well written book. And if you're at all interested, I would encourage you to grab a copy and read it, because it's just amazing, our food and where it comes from, why we do it. So, all right, if you have children coming to your Thanksgiving and you have the custom of putting out books and things for them to do, if they're occasional visitors in your home and you put out books or games, things for them to do. When our kids were young, I always put out books about Thanksgiving, and particularly about, Native Americans and the Pilgrims, and just repeating the story that I had been taught as a child. And then as the grandchildren came along, I began collecting other books. And this is one that is quite relevant today, and particularly with our supply chain problems today. But this is a beautiful book about called Before We Eat. And for Thanksgiving, I think it's an incredibly appropriate book. And lots of adults, love children's books and like to read them. So it's not just for children that you put out the books. But the artist is Mary Azarian. She's from Vermont, and this may very well be the last book she's ever done. But it talks about it for children and for a lot of adults too. It tells the story of where our food comes from and how it gets from that field into our table. And I'm sure some of you are very familiar today with the slow food movement. And that the first time I ever heard about the slow food movement was from a friend up in Maine. And this was several years ago. And he said, he was trying to explain it to me. And he said, and this year, I'm getting together with friends and we're having 100-mile Thanksgiving. I said, John, 100-mile Thanksgiving, what is that? Well, he said, all of our food that we will have on the Thanksgiving table will be sourced within 100 miles. And thanks to the small farm movement, and thanks to the fact that all of us are now becoming more and more aware, and part of that's thanks to COVID, about where our food's coming from and how it's getting to our table. This year, John and his friends are able to say we're having a 20-mile Thanksgiving, which is pretty wonderful. And that has implications for our environment, for everything. So this is really a neat book, and it's nice to have on the table. Okay, so how are we going to decorate that? Well, this is one thing that's a lot of fun to do, and there's still time to do it. And that is to take what Martha Stewart done, Cinderella squashes. In other words, this squished down flat squash. This is actually the squashes that we know, all of from our soft skin summer squash zucchinis, all the way down to the blue Hubbards that are gigantic that you actually cut open with an axe because their skin is so hard. All of those squashes come from the North-South American continent. They are all New World. There are gourds that a family of gourds that grew in Africa and go back 10,000 years. But all the squashes that we know as edible squashes came from North and South America. This is identified as a antique French squash. That's fine, because all those seeds got taken to Spain and then by the Spanish and then spread all across Northern Europe. All across Europe, all of Europe. And as seeds are planted in different places, they begin to take on different characteristics, and seeds are selected by those that plant them. And the best and strongest plants are kept and the seeds planted on, and this squash was developed. Those of you who can remember Walt Disney's Cinderella story, that story was derived from the first published collection of fairy tales, Charles Perrault, who was French. And in his illustrations, Cinderella's coach was one of these antique squashes, and hence Martha calling this a Cinderella squash. But this is a very, very hard skin squash that will last for months and months and months and stay fresh. So you can take a squash like this, not a pumpkin, because pumpkins don't last that long, but a hard skin squash like this. You can take a hard skin squash like this and you can decorate the top of it and use that as a centerpiece on your table. You can do this with children, you can do this with friends, you can actually have a 2-day event where you can get a couple of friends or a bunch of kids and head out into the woods and the garden, pick what's left over, what you can find that's interesting looking, bring it back in, and with a little bit of sheet moss or something that you can glue to the top of your Cinderella squash. And this is sheet moss, and this is what I use. I just lay it on there, and using either Duco cement, if you can find it, or this is a floral adhesive. Both of these are hard to find these days, but the Duco you have a better chance of getting your hands on. This is Ace Hardware. And With any luck, your Ace Hardware now has a new supply of Duco cement, but squeezing a little bit of the Duco cement around and then just pushing down hard and waiting for a few minutes to let this form a little blanket on the top of your squash, you can then add all kinds of other things to it using some drops of cement and just build up a really fun arrangement that you can use to decorate your table. 2 or 3 of these down the center of a long table make a very nice with candles in between. Make a really interesting and very attractive centerpieces. The neat thing is, this is a delicious squash. So you can, at the end of the holiday season, remove everything. You have not punctured the squash at all. You simply cut it open and eat it because it's hard skin, and that hard skin keeps the moisture in, and that's why it lasts long. That's the reason for the hard skin, is to maintain the moisture in the squash so that they can be stored for winter. That's why those Blue Hubbards would get put in barns and just hang out there until the last one would be eaten in March or April.
Did you purchase that pumpkin at Market Basket? Squash?
This Market Basket, I have never seen them at market. But mostly it's at farm stands, and the place that usually has quite a number of these is Trader Joe's. And Trader Joe's right at the moment. Is there a Trader Joe's nearby?
Yeah.
Okay. Trader Joe's right at the moment has what they call carnival squash. And you can do the same thing with that. You could, because the carnival squash is a very hard skin. They're about this big around. And they're all striped in all different colors. I think I was there at a Trader Joe's maybe 4 or 5 days ago. They were $1.29 a piece. And the one thing about the carnival squash is that you need to stand there and stand them up and make sure that they stand firmly and straight up if you're going to do this to them, if you're going to decorate the tops of them. And so that means that you should more than likely get there early in the morning before the place is crowded, so that you'll have the space to stand your squashes up. And make sure that they're not because they can have irregular bottoms too. This guy pretty much is a pretty solid bottom, but when I buy these, I have to pick them out and make sure that they're going to stand straight. That's definitely a requirement. But try Trader Joe's at the carnival squash, and you could do that. You could actually do that as a favor for everybody at the table, and just you can glue if you can find the floral adhesive. And I can't tell you, you might be able to find it online. For a long time it was unavailable. It disappeared from the market. I called the company for those of you in the garden club or Smithers Oasis. I called the company and said, okay, where is it? And they said, we don't have it and we don't know when we're getting it again. Suddenly it was available at my wholesaler. So it's possible that you can find this now, but if you can find this, you can glue fresh flowers onto the squashes too. And make sure they're long-lasting fresh flowers. But
Excuse me, Betsy.
yes,
Barbara online wants to know if you can use a glue gun.
you better speak up.
Barbara online wants to know if you can use a glue gun.
I'm thinking. We did a lot of production work, and I had a business for many years and a lot of employees, and we we really never used glue guns because they're hard to use, they're heavy on the hand, and the glue tends to dry out. But I would give a glue gun, if you have a glue gun, give it a shot on a hard skin squash.
Mhm.
I don't think it would damage it at all. Hot glue would damage fresh flowers,
Mhm.
but it wouldn't damage anything dry. And so you can collect leaves, you can collect acorns, you can collect horse chestnuts, you can collect, you can buy nuts, whole walnuts and hazelnuts at the supermarket. I mean, you could really have a lot of fun with. You could glue onions, you could glue small garlics, shallots, all of those would be gluable with a glue gun and not be damaged. Anything fresh though, I wouldn't use. And some of you, I'm sure, still have hydrangeas because there really has not been a serious, we've had a frost, but I've seen blue hydrangeas still in bloom outside municipal kinds of buildings where there's still a lot of warmth from the buildings. And it's perfectly fine to go shopping at municipal buildings. As long as you're just. They're never going. So what is this all about? What this is all about is a message I've been trying to deliver to people for years and years and years and years. Well, first of all, dried is going to be beautiful. But more importantly than that, this really isn't a dried flower arrangement. This is a collection of plant material that happens to be dried, some of it. There are some fresh, there are fresh nuts here, there are fresh potatoes down here, this is fresh garlic right here. I could have put apples in here or pears if I wanted to. But this is a collection of plants that represent a total harvest. When we celebrate Thanksgiving, this year, especially if we're lucky enough to get together with family and celebrate getting together with family, thank goodness, for this particular holiday. We will celebrate having our turkey and we will celebrate all kinds of things, but we no longer think in terms of what is a total harvest. The reason for a harvest holiday, a day of giving thanks, is because when there is a good harvest, that you and your family and your community will make it through the non-growing season. And the non-growing season can be deadly and used to be extremely deadly to families and also small communities. If you didn't have everything stored away that you could draw upon during the non-growing months, then you could be in serious trouble, very serious trouble. And so this represents, to a small degree, what was necessary. Well, first of all, there are oak leaves in here. There are oak leaves here and here that have been colored, most decidedly. But there are also beech leaves. There's also pine cones. Those three represent all the wood that would be needed. Wood to make the fires, wood to build the structures, wood to make the furniture, the wood, all the wood. Think sometime about all the wood that was needed to create a dwelling and to make it reasonably comfortable and to keep it warm all winter long. Pine cones most decidedly go in. Do you know that none of us would be here if it wasn't for pine trees? It's pine pitch. The pitch from the pine tree They sealed the hulls of the ships. That until pine pitch became high tech thousands of years ago, a boat could just go out and come back very quickly. It couldn't cross a pond, it couldn't cross a lake, it couldn't cross an ocean because the hull leaked. But once humans discovered pine pitch and you could pitch your hull, you could preserve your food with pine pitch. Have any of you ever had Racina? It's a Greek wine that has little piney scent and flavor to it. Racina. Racina is a very, very, very old wine. And it was made and stored in what's called an amphora, which is a storage container that's sort of shaped like this with handles on it, and corked and then pitched to preserve the wine. And to this very day, some amphora were this large, and they were used to ship olive oil, vinegar, and wine back and forth across the Mediterranean. And occasionally there would be an accident, there would be a large storm, a ship would go down. To this very day, they're still pulling amphora out of the bottom of the Mediterranean Ocean. With the pine pitch intact and the olive oil, the vinegar, or the wine still intact inside that amphora because the pine pitch kept it fresh and didn't allow the water to get it, waterproofed it completely. So pine cones definitely, most decidedly, not just for Christmas decorations, but for, wow, this is really cool. Not to mention that there are seeds here that are quite edible too. Here we have mountain ash berries. Mountain ash berries are incredibly beneficial. They are edible. They're full of vitamin A and C. They were used to make a drink soaked in vodka in Eastern Europe, soaked in vodka and then sticked all during the winter. And it was a vitamin mix because there's so much A and C in the berries of mountain ash. They were also used for jams and jellies and pies, and they're totally edible, but we ignore them completely. This is teasel. This is a thistle. This is a small thistle. A well-grown teasel is this long, and it's used to create a soft surface to wool. And wool was definitely something that kept human beings warm through the winter. You were lucky if you had a wool suit. These are poppy pods, and this is golden yarrow. Both of these important medicinal herbs. And poppies always have, as well as a source of tea here and the poppy seeds here, and just plain old potatoes and garlic and corn, of course. This is the head of an ornamental allium, but that also represents the entire allium family, all of which is edible. Up here you have grains, some black millet, and then of course the wheat. And so the message is, the more you can get in there, but just think about when you wander through your garden, you think, oh, that's lovely. I remember that was love. That was lavender, and this was brilliant red. And I just so enjoyed this color over here. But think about, wait a minute, what other uses did those plants have? Because all around us, there are plants that could sustain us if we needed to be sustained. And it's fun and it's instructive, and it's somehow can be a little uplifting to wander around, look at everything growing around you and realize how much it can offer you in sustaining your life, improving your life, and just, creating a better place for us all. So, anyway, so are there questions now? I have wandered and,
What is the base of that arrangement?
I'm sorry, say that, you better take your mask off, because the one announcement I did make is that my
What is
ears
the
are blocked.
base of that arrangement? Some kind of oasis,
Oh, what happened? Yes, that is a dry oasis.
dry oasis?
Yeah.
How did you put your leaves in?
Oh, these leaves,
Yeah, did you glue them in or what?
all right. The leaves, oak leaves, and you can still wander around the woods and collect oak leaves, whether they're singly or whether they're in sprays. Oak, all oaks have a natural waxy surface to them. And that natural waxy surface preserves the moisture inside the leaf. So that you can take, and I forgot to do it, but under my living room rug, if you pulled it back, you can come home with me, we can do it together. You could see all kinds of spray oak leaves pressed under the living room rug, because you can press sprays of oak leaves and then use them in their natural state in decorating, and they will hold for several weeks until they get too dried out. These are real oak leaves that have been sprayed with, this one has been sprayed with a, in the floral industry, there's a whole line of spray paints called Design Master, all developed to color plant material. And so that's how this was done. This one, I suspect, was dipped into some Design Master, but I've never been able to figure out how they did this. I purchased both of these, I didn't do them myself. But this is very clear that somebody cut oak leaves and then just went, because you can see that it's, you can still see the leaf. But this one, you can't. Both of these were fresh on stems, fresh stems. You cut the stems, they were still green on the inside when I purchased them. This is a year old. This one I got this year. But once they've been sprayed, they will stay for a good long time. So you can either wire them to a pick individually and use them that way, or if they're on stems, and this is, let's see if I can. Pull one of these out without destroying even more. I want to show you. Yeah. There's its stem right there, so that I just cut this so that it was an individual leaf and then just put it right into the oasis that way. These leaves are copper beech, and there, let's see. Okay. I can probably take. I'm not going to get that one. All right, there's one back here. This is just a small. This is, and I'll pass this around. If you're not familiar with leaves that have been preserved in glycerin, this is a leaf that has been preserved in glycerin, and I can pass it around so you can feel it. This is something that you can do yourself, but not until next June, because there are a number of leaves that preserve well in using a glycerin water solution. And what you do is you go to the pharmacy and buy a bottle of glycerin, and you mix that half and half with warm water in a glass jar, and I use a candy jar. And then you cut sprays of woody leaves, and the ones that do the best in my experience are oak leaves, mountain laurel, sweet fern, and beech. All right, and whether it's just the copper beech, which is a smaller leaf, or a regular beech, which is the larger. And you cut sprays, you snip the bottom of the stem up the center about 1.5 inches, and you put that into your jar of glycerin and warm water. And then you put it somewhere where you can watch it. And this needs to be done after the leaves have hardened off in the spring. I mean, in early summer, so that they're not tender leaves, that they're young but mature leaves. And the weather needs to be warm. If it's cold, it's going to go very slowly. If it's warm, it should work within a week or so. And as the leaf aspirates, as the stem, the branch aspirates, and moisture evaporates from the leaf and needs to be pulled up from the bottom of the stem, that glycerin is pulled into the leaf, and the leaf is preserved from inside it. It feels like plastic, but it's not. That's a natural leaf. It's on its natural stem, and it will last for years and years. I mean, literally years. But once it's done, it's fun to watch it because the glycerin. You can watch the glycerin go up through the major veins of each leaf, and then slowly move out through the little capillary veins to the edge of the leaf. Once the glycerin gets almost to the edge of the leaf, you need to take that branch out and hang it upside down, because you don't want the glycerin to begin spilling out of the leaf, because it will. And some of you may remember 1,000,000 years ago when we were first introduced to glycerinized eucalyptus sprays, that you would hang them on the wall, and suddenly the juicy thing would start dripping down the wall. Well, that's because there was too much glycerin, and in a warm interior, then the glycerin just begins to move again. So, but it's really neat to do. Does that answer your question? Yes. Good. Okay. All right. Any other questions?
So I'm actually going to say thank you, Betsy. You guys are welcome to stay for a little bit, but I do want to let our online attendees go. So feel free to hang around, chat with Betsy, get a book, buy a book, have it signed. Signed books are gold, especially during the holidays. And I just really want to thank you all for being here, because this is one of our first larger in-person programs, and it's just really nice to see all of your faces, even if they're behind masks. So thank you all for being here, and I hope you stay for a few minutes to just hang out.
Well, are you going to have a draw?
I am, but I'm just gonna let our
okay.
attendees go.
All right.
But so hold on for 1 minute.
Yeah, because somebody can take this home, and somebody can take this home.
Okay.
And
How are you doing with drawing? I'm just